good evening, good afternoon, and a very early good morning to many people who are joining from different time zones around the world. This session, my name is Alexander Wellsteed. I'll be moderating today. This session, I think it may be the last in the calendar day for our Asian Evaluation Week here on the first day. And what we're looking at this evening, particularly interesting presentation, presented by two very good friends and colleagues from the World Bank Group in Washington. We're going to be looking at evaluating MDB approaches to private capital mobilization for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's my great pleasure to introduce two colleagues who will be speaking with us today. We are delighted to welcome for his first experience at Asian Evaluation Week, but no stranger to the international evaluation community, is José Carbajo, who is Director of the Financial, Private Sector and Sustainable Development Unit at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. José has had a very long and distinguished career working with many of the evaluation units in groups such as EBRD and the European Investment Bank, as well as ADB. He'll be starting off the presentation and then handing over to Raghavan. Raghavan Narayanan is a friend of long standing, and Raghavan has very graciously attended, I think this may be his third or fourth Asian Evaluation Week. He is a bit of a rock star on the presentation. Last year, I know he took the stage and delivered a really excellent presentation. Raghavan has extensive experience in looking at private sector related issues, particularly the World Bank Group's International Finance Corporation work in mobilization of capital. And we're delighted to have him join us again this year in a virtual capacity. It's very early morning for Raghavan, so we're very pleased that he could join us here. As said previously, my name is Alex Wellsteed. I work with a very talented team in Manila, where we look at ADB's private sector operations and run evaluations looking at work in equity and public-private partnerships and additionality as well. And my job as moderator, we'd be delighted. This is very much a participatory event. So you will find on your screen, on your Zoom screen at the bottom sort of center, you'll find something that says Q&A. And we'd really encourage you during the presentation, or we're going to leave time at the end for a question and answer session, to encourage you to put your questions there to the presenters. I've had a brief glimpse at the presentation that's coming, and I think it's of real interest, particularly not just for evaluators, but people in wider capacities, but to really look at a fairly complex evaluation where you're looking at some very big long-term outcomes that we're trying to focus on, and seeing how you put together a presentation, you looking at both methodological challenges that lead to a thorough and in-depth evaluation of a particular core area of interest. So the theme again today is evaluating multilateral development banks' approaches to private capital mobilization for the Sustainable Development Goals. And to start off our presentation, I'd like to invite José to tell us really a little bit, to kick off, tell us about the motivation for this area of study and evaluation. Why are we looking at this particular issue of private capital mobilization, and why now? José, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your kind introductions. And it is a pleasure to participate in the first day of the Asian Evaluation Week 2020. Indeed, a first for me. I take this opportunity together with my colleague Raghavan Narayanan to share our experience and thoughts regarding the challenges evaluators face, because this is going to be the focus of our presentation when assessing this rather relevant topic of private capital mobilization, or PCM. I will be referring to it as PCM for short from now on. First of all, my sincere and most thanks and appreciation to all AEW 2020 co-organizers, and of course, especially special messages of thanks to our colleagues and counterparts in the Asian Development Bank. So I want to do three things in addition to, well, one of them, what you asked, to set the context and motivation. First, I want to provide that context. You were asking, motivating, why PCM matters and where does the assessment of PCM falls in the work program of IG, because it's an ongoing concern, as it were, or exercise. Second, I will briefly describe the outline of our joint presentation, because this is not two separate presentations. This is just one building up. And third and last, I will summarize the type of challenges to start with that evaluators face when designing and scoping an evaluation of PCM approaches and instruments in MDBs. So let's start with slide number 2, please. Regarding context, a good way to think about it is in terms of a set of interrelated priorities that MDBs, DFIs, and its client countries face at a global scale. So what are the global priorities? We all know public capital and donor financial flows cannot meet the needs, demands, and requirements of sustainable development goals. The 2030 agenda, which by the way is around the corner. We set this up years ago, and all of a sudden we have 10 years and we have to accelerate. So, and this is the challenges associated with that agenda, as you know, is very, very top of the agenda in development and government priorities, both in developing countries and emerging markets. Now it's well accepted and understood that, you know, to achieve SDGs, you need to mobilize as much private capital as possible, which implies, you know, touching or tapping on sources of financing beyond increasing capital domestic revenues. You know, normally we think in terms of three channels for capital for development, to tap capital for development. One is domestic resource mobilization. The other two are international public finance, and of course the private capital. And it's all well understood that private capital, the third channel, is expected to play an increasingly important role. That's where the money is. So that's one. I mean, we can talk about numbers, but many of you are familiar with them. In terms of client priorities, thanks to the additional funds, there is an additionality element understood in a narrow sense that private capital options facilitates. Governments and firms, and by firms I mean both state-owned enterprises and private companies, can potentially design and implement development projects with better timing, for example, either in implementation, but also with greater scope. And here I emphasize the word potentially, because as you know, a critical potential, again, or critical limitation that we face is the challenge of building a robust project pipeline that allows investment planning, implementation, and financing while managing transaction costs. I'm sure Raghavan will touch on this later on. Last but not least, MDB and DFI priorities, the world that we moved in. PCM can provide balance sheet relief to these institutions. And therefore, it creates a potential multiplier and demonstration effect. If you allow me a little bit of pedantic microeconomics here, it's a little bit like having an output and a substitution effect. So the output effect is in the form of potentially more and larger investment, right? Addressing SDGs. The substitution effect is by creating precisely room in this balance sheet, institutional balance sheets, that you can channel savings to SDG sectors that do not attract private capital as easily. So it is the interaction between this interrelated set of global client and MDB priorities that provide the context for the assessment of PCM approaches and instruments. And context which evaluators, of course, need to be very much have in mind and be aware when designing their evaluations. Now, what does it all mean from us, coming from IG, from the Independent Evaluation Group? If we can move to the next slide, please. Well, the evaluation of PCM approaches and instruments is really new. I mean, IG and many other evaluation departments, including you, Alex, who are in the brink of releasing an evaluation, we were told, of PPPs, have been doing this for some time. So IG's work program consists of thematic evaluations. You can see here in the slide, meso evaluations, individual project and program evaluations, and all of them touch directly and indirectly on PCM. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you need to place the PCM evaluation in the right context as far as IG is concerned. In the context of an evolving and comprehensive work stream on mobilizing finance for development, and as an additional building block to understand what PCM approaches and instruments work, why they work, for whom they work. just to give you a couple of, and there is a list of things that we have done here. For example, the IG evaluation on the experience of PPPs, which is already 6 years old, it was released in 2014, highlighted the lack of local capacity for the preparation of bankable projects, which is an important aspect which is linked to mobilizing private capital. Another example is the evaluation of capital market development that we did, which looked at domestic bond market and infrastructure financing. And that evaluation stressed that PCM impact on bond issuance depends on the scale of the market, but also on the integration of advisory work, which is part and parcel of what we will call catalyzation. I will introduce that concept later, and so on. So this is just to reflect that this is an ongoing, I would say, as an ongoing effort, an ongoing work program or work stream. And for us in IEG, it's very relevant. We are lucky that Raghavan, for example, has been also the task team leader, not just for an evaluation that we have recently finished on PCM, but also on other components. So that's context. Context in terms of global priorities, client and MDBs, and context in terms of IEG. Now, if we move to the next slide, please, slide outline. Here, so having described the context in terms of priorities and IEG work program, this slide is simply to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we plan to do. As I mentioned before, I plan to discuss the first topic, the issues related to scoping of evaluation of PCM approaches and instruments, such as the definition, PCM values, the timing, and the role of PCM across institutions. And then Raghavan will look both at the methodological challenges and opportunities that are presented in these efforts, but also the options and the risk mitigants. The risk to address the challenges presented by the evaluation. So let me start right away. If we can move to the next slide, please, on definitions. Definitions always matter, and we have several of them. There is a definition of PCM agreed by the 2018 MDB task force, and the main criteria centers around the notion of direct involvement by the MDB with specific projects and activities for which the private sector is providing finance. So private capital mobilization of PCMs includes both private direct mobilization, which is financing from a private entity on commercial terms, or into direct and active involvement of MDB, and what we call private indirect mobilization, which is financing again from private entities, but where no MDB is playing an active or direct role. That's broadly speaking. We can go into more details. Now, even within the challenge for evaluators is that even within the commonly agreed MDB framework, PCM may be approached differently across institutions. For example, the IFC uses the concept of core mobilization to mean third-party finance, which is deployed as a result of active and direct effort for IFC. Nothing wrong about that. That is still within the line, but it includes third-party funding from both private and public sources. For example, including, for example, other MDBs, DFIs, and sovereign wealth funds, as long as this additional finance is predicated on commercial terms and is raised due to the active and direct efforts of IFC. So what happens is that as a consequence of this different interpretation of a common definition, the treatment of commercial capital and co-financing in PCM projects via sovereign wealth funds or DFIs, as I was saying, can create different set of internal incentives in terms of how institutions approach PCM. And that presents challenges to evaluators who have to be aware of them and try to reconcile them. Another challenge regards the definitions, not yet on volume and data, if we can still keep on the definitions. Another challenge is the definition relates to how evaluators should treat the interaction between, on the one hand, the many activities that the public sector side, the institutions do on the public sector side, that pave the way of facilitate future PCM and private sector participation. Let's say, for example, the removal of investment barriers of the reform of legal frameworks. And on the other hand, the private sector activity downstream that are measured at PCM. This is a challenge because to assess all the policy dialogue, upstream advisory interaction, etc., that would mean that you are defining an evaluation, the scope of which is extremely large, and therefore it becomes unmanageable. Consequently, the scope has to be implied or guided by the definition of PCM from the MDB Harmonization Working Group. And I'm sure Raghavan will comment further on this. This is what is called catalyzation, all the activities that help directly or indirectly motivate the private sector along the project cycle and the sector reform. Now, one final aspect related to the definitions challenge. How should an evaluator treat PCM projects within an IFI, group or across MDBs? Who is mobilizing whom and at what time? There are many examples of this. What happens when more than one IFI is present in the financing structure? How should PCM be counted? What are the risks leading to double or even multiple counting? And even beyond metrics, how does one attribute merit to the PCM effort? I mean, an example that comes to mind in our World Bank group is the role of MIGA, which many times is brought to the table last. And it is true that its participation completes the financing package, so to say, but it's not clear to what extent the PCM value should be fully attributed to one institution or even more. So that's something that you have to keep in mind as you are scoping the evaluation. Now, now we are on the right slide. Now I'll move on to slide number 7, volume and data. Look, if we could move back, possible, to the previous volume and data. Thank you very much. I will be brief here. So the question here is that, record keeping of PCM faces challenges within the MDBs. First, there are different practices of record keeping and accounting for PCM across MDBs and within them, number one. Number two, it is difficult to identify oftentimes how PCM flows are linked to SDGs or climate agenda, for example. Bear in mind that PCM is just a necessary condition, but not sufficient to achieve development impact. You mobilize private capital for sure, but then inventors' project needs to be identified, designed, carried out, and how such projects involve PCM and how they are linked to SDG and climate agendas remains a challenge from the point of view of assessing volume and data. Third, beyond record keeping, there is this shortcoming that I was mentioning before. We are still not in timing, so if we could go back. Thank you. The third is that there is this shortcoming that I was mentioning just now. It limits what evaluators can say about country level achievements over time. You know that we all know there is a renewed interest in assessing development progress, having the country as the analytical focus of attention. In other words, is PCM making a difference to development based on country metrics? And I'm sure Raghavan will touch on this as well. The point here is that ultimately the challenge for evaluators is not just about monitoring the PCM flows, but also assessing the effectiveness in terms of what works and why, as I was mentioning before. Now, please, if we could move to the slide on timing. Timing is extremely relevant and also represents, again, a serious challenge for evaluators when scoping an evaluation of PCM. For example, country level outcomes, as I was saying before, they may not be that obvious unless the PCM project or projects are systemic for the country, such as transformational energy project or other SDG related big project. I'll share a thought or an illustration in terms of PPPs. A single PPP project may be quite meaningful and innovative, for example, in the way risks are transferred and allocated across the parties, and perhaps the way in which public sector has learned from public procurement practices that may be innovative as well. But if it becomes an isolated island of excellence, it's not clear that it will have a systemic impact or the transformational outcome that is being sought. So that's when you have to think, okay, how are we going to assess PCM just from the basis of the impact of that single project or a continuum? The questions for evaluators tend to be, okay, should projects that provide additional financing to existing projects be treated as new PCM or all PCM with, an expanded amount of finance? When does the PCM get booked? Is it at approval stage? Is it at commitment of financial closing? At disbursement? At project construction? Different instruments have different booking dates, and it presents again another sort of metrics challenge. So these are the issues that we confront and represent the timing challenges that evaluators face when assessing PCM approaches and instruments. Next slide, please. And this is the last one. I hope that we're doing good on time, Alex, otherwise let me know. So institutions' role and instruments. Let me say finally a few words about the different roles and instruments across institutions in the PCM space. Now, MDB have similar objectives, many similar objectives, but they also play different roles and have several approaches and instruments when it comes to PCM. Take the place where Raghavan and I work, the World Bank Group, for example. In general, it mobilizes private capital by combining two approaches. On the one hand, it has an approach that deploys a mix of finance and guarantee instruments, setting up investment platforms like the AMC, asset management company, using short-term financing initiatives, PPPs, advisory, what have you. The other approach involves working more directly with clients, governments, private corporations, investors, insurers, etc. Development partners, what have you. Now, yet within that general two-pronged approach, each institution within the World Bank Group mobilizes private capital differently, using perhaps the comparative advantage, right? The World Bank mobilizes private capital primarily through guarantee instruments, leverages its balance sheet to mobilize private capital, but its principal contribution is via the catalyzation of private capital, all these upstream policy dialogues and activities that eventually give room for more private capital flows. The IFC, on the other hand, has a range of instruments that mobilize private capital more directly, including debt and equity, financing platforms that pull capital from institutional investors, insurance firms, institutional investors, what have you. Sovereign agencies, as well as we were mentioning before. Finally, you have MIGA. It can be argued that the multilateral investment guarantee agency facilitates PCM no matter what it does, you know, including its political risk insurance and non-honorary guarantee instruments. Now, the interesting thing is that within that range of PCB instruments, the roles and approaches, so some of them can be either complementary or substitutes. And in some cases, the way we are we have created the framework, some of them qualify for PCM and some of them don't. So you have this example. Public-private partnership advisory qualifies, public procurement advisory, perhaps not. Guarantees qualify, but not syndicated loans. Active equity funds qualify, but not passive tracker funds. So it becomes a little bit of a tricky issue to navigate, you know, which ones, and these are these differences, roles, instrument approaches, really create a challenge for evaluators, keep us entertained, for sure. And Raghavan will address how we address those risks and those options. In any case, one bottom line that evaluators have to do is to, when they look at cross institutions and these different approaches, is to account, and this is something that is bottom line, to account for the balance sheet implications of each instrument based on the institution's risk appetite and the capacity to mobilize private capital, as I was alluding earlier on. So this comes to the end of my presentation. On scoping challenges, Raghavan, as I said, will discuss methodological challenges and options to address, including risk mitigants. And I conclude by thanking you for your attention. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Jose. I mean, I'm slightly in awe here. I think Raghavan's got a very tough following up act here to provide some of the answers to the real complexity of the scoping challenge that you've put in front of us. I mean, I'm really intrigued to hear, I don't know whether Raghavan can share with us about how, if you're looking at particular SDGs of the 17, whether there were particular challenges addressing or tracking private capital mobilization for specific goals. I'd be interested to hear that maybe in the question and answer at the end. But Raghavan, the stage has been set by Jose. And really interested to hear how you took on this challenge and looked at some of the methodological approaches that you used to address this big problem set that's put in front of us. Over to you, Raghavan.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be back at AEW again for the third year in a row. Thank you, Jose, for highlighting the strategic issues that we faced in this particular topic. I want to start off by saying that this topic has been lingering in the evaluation world for more than the last year or so. We started proposing this topic for evaluation 2015. It has a long history with our board members. It has been very, very challenging to get this far, to have this completed this year after starting the idea in 2015. We've had several ups and downs, partly because the topic is pretty controversial from the MDB's point of view. So I'll just spend just a minute to give you an idea of why it's so difficult to put together. Not all MDBs have the variety and the diversity of instruments that can mobilize private capital. Some institutions rely primarily on loans. Some institutions do not have a private sector entity, as part of their group. Some institutions have just one balance sheet, whereas the World Bank Group benefits from having 3 balance sheets that it can leverage. So when it comes to reporting at a global level, it sort of becomes the who's bigger, who's better, who can produce more volumes. So PCM always tends to get thought of as a volume game. And as evaluators, it was important for us to sort of mitigate that risk of making this about volume, but more about outcomes. So just from a strategic point of view, that might be something that if the audience in their respective institutions or ADB is pursuing this topic in the future, it's almost like putting 2 evaluations together. One is looking at the ex ante issues of how the mobilization happened, because a lot of the activities, the inputs from the MDBs are actually captured, and actually they finish at the time of financing. Once the financing is done, your PCM is done. You can start booking the volume in your books and say PCM is successful because I've mobilized. But the real work actually, as an evaluator, it starts afterwards, right? So if you're trying to evaluate what are the outcomes from PCM, your work starts after the financial close. But from the stakeholder perspective, you have to look at what happened ex ante and to what are the activities that led to the PCM outcome, where the PCM outcome is the financial close. But then you also have to look at the development outcome of the project. So it's almost like putting 2 evaluations together. And that's sort of sets the stage for the first slide from my end. If we can move to the next slide, it's the theory of change. It's a very fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves. What is success here? What is the definition of success? What are the drivers of success, right? Because for those who have been coming to this issue from the evaluation sciences perspective, for them, the development outcome, the linkage to the SDGs, that is success, right? But for those who are coming from the PCM angle, some of our counterparts in operations, getting that financial close is success, because once they complete the mobilization accounting, they are done. They move on to the next one, right? So what is success? So you have basically two buckets of success, 2 different sets of drivers. And I'll explain over the next couple of slides how these things can be unpacked. So when you construct the theory of change, what we had to grapple with is, are we focusing on how it was achieved? What are the capacity utilization drivers? What are the effectiveness of the PCM activity versus the effectiveness of the project activity after the financing? You have to grapple with this while constructing the theory of change. And are we focusing on to what extent was the financing package successful? Because without which there's no project, right? So one could argue, especially our counterparts from operations would argue that success in this case is achieved at the time PCM is achieved, because without which there's no project. So we had to unpack that a little bit, split it up, and have basically 2 theories of change, or sort of like a nested theory of change. And when we talk about relevance and effectiveness, the typical criteria we use in evaluations, the question then arises, are we talking about relevance and effectiveness of the project, or relevance and effectiveness of the PCM activities or the PCM instrument? And they can be completely different, and they can have completely different ways of evaluating. you're evaluating the instrument first, and then you have to evaluate the project. So basically, that's what I meant by two evaluations rolled into one, but with just the same budget. So that's another underlying challenge. And we will see that, as Jose highlighted in terms of scoping, we know that not all institutions are equally positioned to achieve certain PCM targets. So every institution needs to set their own targets, their own goals on how much mobilization they can achieve, because they don't have the diversity of instruments or all the toolkits available. So we can't expect an EIB and EBRD to have the same level of contributions to the SDGs as an ADB or a World Bank group. So there are all these kind of institutional differences when you start to benchmark success. When you try to figure out what is driving that success, you have to look at these sort of variances within the institution. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is basically the core of the evaluation, right? Because once you figure out to what extent the instruments have been leveraged to the level of effectiveness the instrument has achieved, then we can start to talk about the projects. But you got to cover the bases first. And for us, this at the World Bank Group, this was a big challenge for us, even during the evaluation. I'll tell you why. We have close to 15 or 20 different types of approaches, whether you look at it from loan perspective or whether you look at it from an equity perspective. We have instruments that are very long-term. So, Jose mentioned the IFC's asset management company, and they mobilize through private equity funds. These funds have a life of 10 to 12 years. They achieve their investment period after 6 to 7 years. So really, you're looking at the full potential of mobilization achieved through a private equity fund over a 7-year period. So it's not like a single project PCM. It's really a cluster of projects within in a PCM managed through a fund, and it has a long life, right? Then you also have short-term PCM instruments, right? And the example was also shared before, trade finance. Trade finance is short-term in two ways. It's a short-term instrument that only works, rather is deployed primarily during times of crisis. So now, as COVID-19 situation, we know that trade finance becomes increasingly important to our stakeholders. But counter-cyclically, like once we are past a crisis stage, again, the volumes of trade finance would generally drop, and then the instrument usage would wane over time. But it's really a short-term instrument as opposed to a long-term instrument like a private equity fund. Then we have also differences with loan instruments and equity instruments. So we have mobilization happening through syndicated loans, B loans as we call it, and I'm sure ADB does similar work. EBRD also has a B loan program. These have completely different characteristics. Their way success is defined for a debt instrument is very, very different than the way an equity instrument is deployed. So let's say we do equity mobilization. A case of Bangladesh comes to mind, where it was a large power generation project. 5 of the World Bank Group instruments were deployed to help that project get to close. It started with a syndicated loan, with IFC mobilizing a syndicated loan along with other partners. ADB was involved in the beginning, then it left the package and it came back into the package. Then we have Amiga Guarantee also providing some sort of support to commercial banks like Standard Chartered, who was involved in the deal. Then we have the asset management company providing some equity loan to the sponsors, equity package to the sponsors. And then we had a World Bank guarantee supporting the off-taker on the other side. So really it's a single project, but it has 5 different instruments and they all have different timelines, right? And they all book mobilization at different points in time. And there are multiple institutions involved. So for a single project can get really complicated, and we should have a view of how to treat those, right? And can this be treated under a single common framework? That becomes the next challenge. How do you put this together where you're going to look at several strategic issues from a Bangladesh point of view, right? Was Bangladesh able to achieve financing for systemic project like power generation? How is that linked to their SDG goals related to climate? Are they generating power through coal, through gas? Is it through solar? So you have this linkages to the question Alex asked. You can basically tie this power generation project to a particular SDG on the access side, the downstream electricity access side. You can link it to a climate side, depending on the type of power that was deployed. You can link it to jobs. So a single project, a systemic project, but this has to be done on an anecdotal basis because just to give you an example, we had about 1,800 projects over 10 years that accounted as PCM. There's no way to aggregate all of them and link them uniquely to all the SDGs. So we had to take sort of like an anecdotal case by case basis, but just to highlight what are the different SDGs that it can target. So these are things that will become part of the methodological challenge. Last point on this particular slide is, how do we measure the success of the instrument? Remember, we talked about this being 2 evaluations put together. The traditional evaluation techniques are very good already to capture the development outcome side of things. We already know how to assess that. But here we have an ex-ante problem. How do we assess whether PCM was good? Is it okay for a particular team to pursue PCM for 5 years to end up mobilizing 10 million, as opposed to doing a policy guarantees of 500 million and just spend just 1 month doing due diligence? So which is better, right? Both can be counted as success because on the books, they're mobilized. But how much resources are you deploying? It becomes a basic economic question. Are we doing things efficiently? Are we doing things effectively? So that not just the timing, but how much internal resources are put together to achieve a certain level of output, in this case, the volume. But how do we assess that? What do we benchmark it against? So if, let's say, IFC claims that they mobilized $7 billion through the asset management company over the last 10 years, is that good, bad? How do we determine that? Do we compare this to Blackstone? Do we compare this to EBRD? Who do we compare that? Do we treat them as a private equity fund manager? Do we treat them as a development agency and just compare them to EBRD and EIB? So all these questions will start to evolve depending on the instruments that your institution is managing to generate PCM. So the benchmarking becomes really fundamental to assess a lot of the ex-ante outputs and activities. Next slide, please. The third issue is, how do our stakeholders think about PCM? So one of the fundamental questions that came up as we are putting this approach paper for this topic together is, we tend to, pick a topic and then we go full steam ahead with it, right? But we also had to ask ourselves, or we were asked at the beginning, is PCM really good? Is mobilizing private sector really good? Is private sector financing really good? So not all stakeholders agree on this point. So you might face certain tricky customers internally or externally who would have to be satisfied with how you approach this. Because there is a huge incentive to do a lot of this through public procurement, through development policy financing, where you don't really need to bother with any financial instrument at all. Simply writing, in our case, what we call a DPL, development policy financing. You can simply write a check for $500 million to do the same power project in Bangladesh that we talked about without having to worry about any private entities, without having to worry about due diligence from Standard Chartered. All this can be done. But is it creating that replication effect? Is it creating that crowding in effect? Is it creating the leveraging effect? So a lot of the stakeholders do not understand these issues very well. So you might face some of those challenges that we did, both internally and externally. Not all stakeholders understand finance. This is a very, very financial instrument-centric, financial analysis-centric topic. Not all of them understand finance. They don't need to, because their life revolves around donor financing, through blended financing and other modalities of of crowding in business, they don't need to worry about that. So a lot more convincing is needed as an evaluator to even push this particular topic to get to an evaluation. So you might see some of that at the approach stage. A lot of the private sector stakeholders have a completely different view. They want to know, okay, so if you want me to play ball with your institution, with the IFC, is it just about financing one project? Because they don't do business for one project. They don't do business for one power project in Bangladesh. They're just not happy with it, right? What is the recurring business model that they can pursue? And do our MDBs have that business development mindset? Do we have that business enhancing platform? Are we doing a project by project? Are we doing a platform approach? So the different stakeholders have different expectations from MDBs because there is a cost associated with working with large bureaucratic institutions like ourselves. So they want to know what is it that they're going to get out of doing being participant in a syndicated package. What is it that they're going to get by becoming a limited partner in a private equity fund? So these are questions that we might have to answer, and we answered some of these questions in our report. But when you start to put these things together, you might want to ask, what kind of evaluation questions are you going to design? And are you just designing questions to answer to the your immediate counterparts and stakeholders? Are we putting this in a larger framework? Are we asking questions for sort of like a global public goods perspective? A lot of institutional investors are happy to work with MDBs, but they also have their own questions, right? Because they want to minimize their transaction costs to do PCM. They don't want to do this, deal by deal. They don't want to do this country by country. They want to have a more comprehensive approach. Now, do our MDB colleagues have that capacity? Do our MDBs think like what the real private sector thinks, or are we doing something very superficial here? So those are the questions we try to answer in our evaluation. And a lot of these times we have to come up with a sort of consensus approach. Our board members will have a set of expectations. Our clients would have a different set of expectations. And then the external private sector entities who are co-financing, they have different sets of expectations. So who holds greater weight? How do we weight their views? So even if you do case studies, even if you do interviews and surveys, where do you land eventually? How do you triangulate? Who gets greater weight? So there's a very interesting challenge. And it's not just about, figures and tables and charts. You really need to think beyond the traditional evaluation methods here to identify certain challenges and try to mitigate them. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, I will try to share some ideas that we bounced back and forth. It took us a while to get there, but you might find them useful if you are working on this topic, whether it's at the project level or at the corporate level. Really, we feel that evaluating a topic like PCM, it requires a little bit of lateral thinking. And, traditionally we fall into this trap. We always look for a strategy document. That's our, sort of like one of the first commandments, but that's just not enough, right? Just because a strategy document exists or doesn't exist doesn't make it good or bad, but it's really, you have to look beyond that, right? Because we've seen cases where there is a very well developed strategy for a particular PCM approach, like guarantees, for example. As Jose mentioned, MIGA is all guarantees, and of course they have a strategy, but is that enough? Maybe not. So you have to figure out what are the things you're going to look for beyond a typical strategy document, and how are you going to benchmark it, right? So what we found useful is really to have more than one tier, really have like 3 tiers of assessment, right? We assess relevance and effectiveness at the instrument level. And as I mentioned, some are short-term, some are long-term, some are debt, some are equity, some are institution specific, some are not. So you really have to assess what are the risks within each instrument, what is the complexity level within each instrument, and do we have the capacity to meet certain targets with certain instruments. So that becomes a challenge at the instrument level. Then we also have to look at, some are investment related instruments, some are advice related instruments. How do you treat them? How do you benchmark them? You cannot put them equal. So PPP, as both Jose and Alex mentioned, is transaction advisory. How do you benchmark an advisory initiative? Because they tend to be really small, they tend to be important for the country, like airports. A lot of PPP advisory is in airports and seaports that tend to be very systemic, but they tend to be like limited size of PCM volume as opposed to a large fund. So how do we treat that? So you need to have a cogent argument around these things. And the benchmarking these instruments can be very time consuming. Just to give you an example, when we benchmarked the private equity funds business, it's very, very controversial because you also have to compare with external benchmarks. How did other private equity fund managers perform? And then you have these reporting issues, you have these timing issues, you have the different treatment of different funds. Some funds are country specific, some are regional, some are thematic. How do you put all those things together? So it can be very time consuming and resource intensive, but we need to understand up front what is the framework we're going to use. And we, for example, used 3 different benchmarking techniques for each instrument, at least, to make it as scientific as possible. This is all on the ex-ante side, right? I'm not even talking about the outcome side. And the evaluation team structure is equally important. We need to have a good mix of people who understand risks, people who understand finance, and people who understand the evaluation sciences, the economics angle, the econometrics piece, without which, we can't have this sort of dual structure in our study. So we need to have a really strong, comprehensive team that looks at all these various issues. Next slide, please. Case studies was one way where we tried to capture some of the outcomes on the SDG side, on the second half of the evaluation, the second part of it. And we need to figure out, like your institutions, you need to figure out to what extent you're able to do that in the COVID-19 context, because a lot of these data collection, your interviews, surveys, they're going to be hampered a little bit. And you also have to be able to interview stakeholders that are part of the co-financing package, not just your immediate counterparts, but also people from the commercial banks, from the investment funds, from the institutional investors, or the sovereign wealth funds. Those opinions and views need to be accounted for. So for example, in our case, just putting a Bangladesh case study took close to 2 months, just interviewing. We're not just interviewing the standard set of people we would for a development outcome evaluation, but we also had to cover a lot of the ex-ante, and people hopefully had to remember, because these things were done much before the financing package was put a long time ago, as you can imagine, before we deal with the construction phase and the execution phase of a power project. So identifying the right stakeholder and getting their views also can be a challenge, but these can all be done on a case study basis as opposed to a comprehensive portfolio level basis. Next slide, please. I think these are standard techniques, but just for private sector evaluations, we have to go a little bit beyond. The onus is on us to be as technical and scientific as possible. We talked about some of these issues. Country level analysis, you have to identify certain using literature review, you need to identify what are the drivers of economic flows, FDI. If you're treating about some of the PCM as FDI flows or portfolio flows, you have to identify in a particular country, how is it driven? Is it coming in directly as FDI? Is it coming in through capital markets? And then you have to identify those set of interventions that your institution was involved in, and to what extent were they systemic interventions, and then build a case out of that. So that requires, we did a lot of such analysis for the case of Egypt, because it's not just the 3 World Bank institutions, but other institutions were involved. And we had to track each one of those PCM flows over a long period of time, not just 10 years, but over a 15-year period, to identify, where people, what are the entry points, where institutions came in, and what outcomes were generated by who at what point in time. It can be really challenging and time consuming. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I guess I gave a good flavor of those methodological issues and the potential solutions. I'll pass it back to Alex for next steps. Thank you.
Raghavan, Jose, thank you. I think Raghavan's talked through that. I mean, it's a bit of an evaluator's sort of deep dive on the issues and complexities there, but I can see we're prompting some questions here already in the Q&A column. If you want to write your Q&A questions in there or raise your hand as well, you're very welcome to do so. A lot of issues drawn up from that there. If I can just highlight one of the questions that's come in already, Raghavan, is from Hyun Song, has mentioned that, you know, we're looking, you described there about the complexity is almost like an evaluation within an evaluation, that you're not just, you know, looking at, you know, the development outcomes on the right-hand side of the theory of change, but you're also looking at the effectiveness of individual instruments for private capital mobilization. And then you're trying to do that all in terms of looking at other MDBs about who is successful in this space and who is not successful in this space. In terms of extracting that, that pertinent data from other counterparts, can I ask, you know, who are the people that you're talking with directly? Are you looking more at documentation? Are you interviewing people in the other MDBs? How are you managing to verify that information from the other MDBs? I mean, this is a very complex study here that I think you've put before us. How did you go about obtaining that information from the other MDBs?
Thank you, Alex. Starting 2018, the MDBs and DFIs including, they have an internal working group. So every institution has a PCM working group that has a representative who's aggregating correctly or incorrectly their institution's contributions to PCM. And there is a joint MDB task force that over the last 2 years has started reporting to what extent they have been generating this volume and to what extent they are addressing certain sectoral constraints. So if you simply go to the joint MDB task force report on mobilization, you would see 2 years, 2019 and 2020, which I think just came out maybe 2 months ago. They started reporting this jointly, and every MDB and DFI has a representative as part of the task force. So we used basically the 3 representatives in our group, one from IFC, one from MEGA, and one from World Bank, who have been reporting not just their own institution's performance, but also been part of these global consultations meetings. And we've used the 2018 framework, the 2019 joint report, and the 2020 joint report to look at those volumes. And when we went to the field, we actually used it not just to look at our case study, but also as an opportunity to interview some of our MDB and DFI colleagues. So we had to make a trade-off between how many cases we wanted to do, but also select the location of those cases so we could meet our MDB and DFI counterparts in those task forces. So that was one way we approached it. But there is data for the last 2 years. But then just take it with a pinch of salt. It's self-reported. There's a lot of conflation there and a lot of double counting and triple counting. And I'll leave it to your own judgment on how to treat those. To answer Hyun Sun's question, private sector clients have no incentive to report on PCM, right? Only, I guess, maybe the last year or two, again, you're hearing a lot about ESG investing and thematic investing, and everybody wants to do good, and they're trying to adapt the MDB's mantra for their own business. But if you go down to the core of it, there's no need for them to report anything specific to SDGs or MDBs. So it really becomes, it's just hope that we carry forward on private sector clients. Regarding your question, Hyun Sun, about how do we link it to SDGs? You can do it in two ways. You can do it at the instrument level, which instruments are used to address a certain challenge, an SDG challenge, or you can also look at it from a sectoral point of view. So we took primarily a sectoral point of view. Like, we know that infrastructure garners probably close to 70 to 80% of all PCM activities. Within infrastructure, you break it down to power, water, roads, transport, etc. And you can then map it. So we actually did a mapping sector by sector on the right side of the equation, and then on the left side, you have various instruments. A lot of them do feed into infrastructure anyway. So you have a little bit of balancing act there to manage.
See. If I can just bring in José back into this conversation here, I understand that this report will be, you're about to take this to the board in the World Bank. Will that be available publicly at a later date to sort of, for us to have a sort of look at the outcomes that came out from this report?
Thank you, Alex. Yes, it will be. But before I answer that question, I wanted to give another perhaps more optimistic twist to the answer that Raghavan has provided to Hyun Song. I mean, I think Hyun Song's question was whether the private sector could get involved in reporting. I think, so here is the normative, or rather the idealistic versus the reality check. I think Raghavan knows well that perhaps it's not in their interest, so they have to be incentivized. But I am more hopeful that through the impact investment and the ESG, as long as there is not what people call greenwashing, perhaps there would be sort of concerted efforts or harmonized efforts, and the IFC is a little bit behind some of them, to be able to for the private sector to get more involved in not just channeling funds and creating platforms. At the moment, many of them might be just symbolic, of not large consideration, but eventually get involved in the reporting. As long as there is an investors community behind them demanding for that, I'm sure that there could be, from BlackRock to the big investment houses, they have been at least explicitly stating that they have an interest in promoting and supporting SDGs. So back to your question, and then I'll come back, if you don't mind. Before I answer your question, Alex, I need to take advantage. There is a
question in the Q&A. Yes. José, I think we've lost you. You're mute at the moment, but I can see we have a question in the Q&A column. If you want to address that as well, that would be very helpful.
Okay, let me check the question. So, very quickly, two things, and then I address the question. One is, we have an issue of observational equivalence here. I mean, you see a given amount of mobilized private capital, and you don't know the amount of effort that has gone behind it. And therefore, for the same amount, you have different approaches, different roles, different efforts. And that goes to the heart of what Raghavan was saying before, in terms of, the opportunity cost that, that lifting or raising, at least in the ex-ante effort, certain private capital amount goes with it. Now back, I just taken advantage of my opportunity. Back to your question, really, Alex, before I go to the Q&A. Yes, in a way, the answer is yes. There is a report that we will discuss with our Committee on Development Effectiveness next week, as it turns out. And in a way, this session for us is a wonderful marketing opportunity to whet your appetite, to wait for the report to be made public. Now, there is a period of time between discussion and approval at the board, as you know, and public disclosure. And that involves also a certain degree of reduction, in the sense that there is market confidential information that cannot be shared with the public for obvious reasons, particularly with those institutions in the World Bank Group that work with the private sector. So, but the answer is yes. Now, you wanted me to look at the question.
Please, we have a question in the Q&A column. I'm very excited to hear about where the report released, but we have, RSU is asking here, have you looked at the flaws in terms of what counts as mobilization versus co-financing in joint MDB reporting that has been done?
I think that this is a question that is recurrent, and not only us, we have been, I think Raghavan will be probably better placed to provide all the angles answer to this question, but it's not only a concern, it's concern that comes from different stakeholders. Even though it was an aspect that was, let's put it this way, when we started designing the evaluation, we were very keen to look into it. But getting different, there is an opportunity cost of what you looked at it. And we agreed from the very beginning, for the reasons that have to do with the tensions created of what is it that you include in the scope of the evaluation, whether it is just private capital mobilization only or catalyzation, all these upstreams and policy dialogue activities, etc., advisory, we decided to stick to the definition of the MDB harmonization working group. And that, of course, tied our hands, even though we know, this is the typical topic that, and again, I'll pass on I'll pass over to Raghavan, but this is the typical topic that will be listed in the areas of further research as things that you want to look into when we finish this evaluation. Over to you, Raghavan.
Thank you both. I think the short answer is that evaluating the report from the joint MDBs beyond our ambit, so we didn't do that. We were toying with the idea of doing the sort of audit kind of a function. It can be a forensic audit or a regular audit, but again, we stayed away from that. But what we did do as an alternative to auditing the numbers is apply the definition as stringently as possible across the entire suite of instruments and portfolio. And we identified gaps within the World Bank group. We are not going beyond the World Bank group. We can't. We've not been asked to do that. So within the World Bank group, we identified areas where this conflation exists, where this double counting might exist, but without going into the audit aspect, like not correcting the numbers itself. We simply stayed at, to what extent have the criteria been applied, the definitions have been applied well, and why certain institutions have different sub-definitions under those. Commercial capital from public sources acting as private capital, that is a very complex variation of PCM. So within those, we were able to make our views known. Now, on the larger question again, if there is a concerted effort, just like there's a joint MDB reporting, if in the future there is joint evaluation group task force, if all of us who are part of this journey, if we have our own task force, maybe we could come up with some innovative joint evaluation in the future, but that's just me.
I think that's a really interesting prospect, Raghavan. Thank you very much indeed. I'm a little conscious of time. I know we've reached the top of the hour on this conversation. If there are no more questions in the Q&A column, I think we'll close it out here. But I just really wanted to thank colleagues, fellow evaluators from the World Bank team for coming in, and Raghavan, as you've done every year, really sharing some of your knowledge for the benefit of the wider community. You're tackling head on some of the really interesting, challenging areas in evaluation, which we all really benefit from. And I think, all of us in the evaluation community are really fascinated about these long-term SDG objectives and how we can best orient the institutions that we're working with and for to chase after those goals and to document it and to compare and improve. On that basis, as I say, we're really looking forward to when this report comes out in a more public capacity and looking at some of the data that you've managed to obtain. But thank you for talking us through a very complex evaluation challenge, but a really pertinent one, a really valuable one for the wider community.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and organizers.
Thank you, everyone. Let's go.